Greetings and welcome back to my video series, What's Not to Like about Dr. Henry Abramson. And just to be clear, what I'm doing here is not in any way a summary of what Dr. Abramson has done in his videos. If I quote him, I quote him, but if I don't, then what you're hearing is my own and not his. So I wanted that to be clear. Anyway, to recap from last time, I talked about the double stroke public relations coup of the early 4th century in which the Diocletian persecution had the result of emphasizing and bringing to people the idea that one could very happily die in the service of Christ. It brought throughout the empire demonstrations over and over and over again of how cheerfully people would be beaten, whipped, tortured, and killed, and without this really seeming to be a problem for the victims. And that got a whole lot of people really interested. This was followed, of course, by the miraculous military victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, as a result of which we ended up with a Christian emperor. And then, in 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea, the most important meeting ever in the history of Christianity, which was a meeting called by this new Christian emperor. And of course, the very fact that the emperor and all subsequent emperors, except for Julian the Apostate, were Christian, was the second part of the public relations coup, which was achieved by Christianity and which lifted the demographics of the faith from a very small minority of the Roman Empire to a majority. Leading up to the Council of Nicaea, I talked about the dispute of the Donatists. These are people who felt that if someone had been a traitor, if someone had given over scriptures to the authorities to be burned, and who were not willing themselves to undergo torture and death in the name of Christ, should not be Christian leaders, that they just didn't get it, and they needed to be kept out of the Christian fold as being essentially unchristian. Then at the Council of Nicaea itself, how strange an assembly that must have been, where all of these senior bishops from all over the Roman Empire were assembled, and they were in rough shape from the Diocletian persecution. They were scarred, they were burned, they were crippled, they were blinded, they were missing body parts. And here they were now in the company of the emperor, talking about Arianism being something that they felt worthwhile to stamp out in favor of call it a symmetrical Trinitarian view. Now, time went on, of course, and I discussed the result that played out in the latter part of the 4th century of the Christianization, not just of the empire, but of the Roman aristocracy and indeed the emperor himself, creating an ideological power vacuum into which stepped St. Augustine, with his development of a theology that could serve the power, the political, temporal power of Rome, introducing such ideas for the first time as the just war, the idea that a Christian could not only kill someone, but do so professionally. This was new. and I discussed his opponent, Pelagius. Pelagius was a person who promulgated the idea that one is measured by what one does, that talk is cheap, faith is fine, but works is better. And this, of course, was complete anathema to Augustine. Augustine advanced the idea of a redemption from sin brought about by the mediation of the church on one's behalf through the sacraments, the administration of which the church controlled. Pelagius had the idea that it wasn't belief in Christ that mattered. It was, instead, an effort to be like Christ, to imitate Christ, is what mattered. Ultimately, this was obviously something that in the Protestant Reformation was, not just rejected, but Martin Luther was horrified at the idea of the Epistle of St. James. He was of the idea that St. James' Epistle should be struck from the canon because it asks the question, what is faith without works? And indeed, Pelagius fell squarely into that camp, that it's not what you say, it's what you do that matters. Now I'd like to move on to some considerations of what is history. And in this regard, I am very interested in the comments made by Dr. Abramson. He is a very self-conscious historian. He has a sense of what historical investigation is about, but he's reflective about it. He mentions from time to time, he mentions a 19th century German historian who describes history as being what really happened. And there is underlying, certainly, the writing of history in the modern era, the idea that history can be a science, that we can look at recognizable data points and assemble those into what we can accept as being what really happened. But ultimately, history is a matter of consensus. Napoleon famously described history as being an agreed-upon fable, which sounds cynical, but in some respects it's not even cynical enough, because behind the writing of history is almost inevitably some kind of an agenda. Now, it can be a good one, it can be a bad one, it can be, who knows, but an agenda nonetheless. That is to say, an historian, in selecting and presenting data points, is choosing what it is the historian wants you to know. Now, that doesn't mean that an historian cannot seek to achieve that Archimedean point of objectivity. Famously, Archimedes said that if he had a lever long enough, he could move the earth. And this comes up actually in the context of journalism, that journalists seek that Archimedean point, that point that's far enough away from everything that it is unaffected by agendas, but that's impossible. Ultimately, there has to be, in my view, an agenda behind the writing of all history. That isn't to say that history cannot be scientific, and I'm attracted to the idea of the science of history. To give an example, the question arises in historical analysis, when was the Exodus? When did the Jews leave Egypt? And the debate is between the earlier date, I guess probably 16th century BC, the theory being that the people known as the Hyksos were occupying Egypt, and there was a Hyksos pharaoh, and that this Hyksos pharaoh was Semitic, not Egyptian, and therefore was quite friendly to the Jews. And this would be the pharaoh who befriended Joseph. And that after the expulsion of the Hyksos, as the book of Exodus begins, there arose a man who knew not Joseph. Well, somebody who was not friendly to the Semitic people, the Jews, and this led to the story of the Exodus. Well, fine, that sounds quite plausible. There's the later date theory, which looks at, I think there's a reference to Ramses in the book of Exodus, and the thought is, well, that's probably 13th century, maybe around 1250 BC, and so that's a date for the Exodus. Well, who knows? Well, I had an occasion in the 1990s to meet a colleague of my wife, a fellow by the name of Carl Skorecki, who was doing a lot of early work with DNA. And he's a nephrologist, a kidney doctor by profession, but he sort of had I call it a hobby, I guess, of looking into the DNA record, and ran some tests on the hereditary priesthood within Judaism known as the Kohanim. And he found, startlingly, that the Kohanim, who are said to have been descended from Moses' brother Aaron, he found that they had a genetic marker, and that this genetic marker permitted the identification of a common ancestor of the Kohanim, who lived in the middle of the 13th century. Well, what a startling thing is that, but it's that sort of data point that will assist, that can assist in the determination of what really happened. But you can only take it so far, and it tips very quickly into speculation. For instance, the Jews had to deal with the Assyrians, particularly the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Assyrians were a particularly savage bunch. They really invented the psychology of fascism, the psychology of empire building that uses terror and fear, and particularly by way of building up a reputation for extreme savagery. And then, as one expands one's empire, you don't enslave people or capture people, or they were the first to realize that if you really want to subjugate people, what you do is you split them up. You just send them all over the place so that they can no longer be the people that they were. And this, of course, is what happens when a succession of Assyrian kings marched in on the northern Jewish kingdom, and there were three of them: Tiglath-Pileser III, followed by Shalmaneser V, followed by Sargon II, and collectively they were able to subjugate the northern kingdom and send the famously the 10 tribes into not exile, but just divided them all up, just distributed them randomly all over the place with the idea of subjugating them not just for that moment, but forever. In other words, that they couldn't be reassembled and brought back. And this was the sort of the evil genius of the Assyrians. Now, and the story goes on, but the point I'm trying to make is that in reference to the story of Jonah, that some historians have the idea that one can identify when the prophet Jonah lived, and that one could do this by looking at the story of Jonah, realizing that Jonah, and of course, the least weird part of the story of Jonah is that he was swallowed by a fish. It's a very bizarre story. I'm not going to try to summarize it, but the upshot is that the prophet Jonah very reluctantly, and we don't even know why he was so reluctant, but very reluctantly goes under God's command to the city of Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was the main base for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And Jonah shows up in Nineveh, and his instructions are to tell them all that they're done for. They've been evil and mean and weird, and that's the end of them. They're about to be destroyed. Well, shock among shocks, it said that the Assyrians repented. Well, how could that be? I mean, Assyrians don't repent. That's that's just too weird to write down. But that's what the story says, and even more strange, contrary to the prophecy that Jonah was issuing, God decides to spare the Assyrians. And this, of course, does not make Jonah happy, and Jonah isn't just not a happy guy. Okay, well, that's the story. But as I say, some historians have looked at the historical record and found that there was a period of time when the Assyrian historical record goes quiet, that they're not beating up on people and scattering them around and doing all the things that the Neo-Assyrians did. And that this was what one historian called the Jonah effect. That the story of Jonah has a place in history, an identifiable place in history. But as I say, that you can only go so far with this, and to leap on such a data point and use that to establish historical dates is an uncertain enterprise at best. Another problem that arises in understanding history and trying to make sense of it is the deliberate falsification of history that takes place over and over again. One of the best examples of this would be the falsification of the story of Richard III, an English king who ultimately was defeated by Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII after defeating Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 in England. The date when everyone in England went running to the window, pointed and said, "Look, it's the Renaissance." The story has come down to us through Shakespeare, is that Richard III was a terrible, horrible, demented, bent-over individual who killed the princes in the Tower. Well, none of that apparently happened. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Josephine Tay called The Daughter of Time, where she not only recounts the what really happened, but also talks about how the record was falsified. And the falsification of the record has a long, sad history. We were talking about Constantine. There's a document famously called the Donation of Constantine, which was a document supposedly issued by the emperor, which said that the Pope in Rome was to have temporal as well as spiritual authority. In other words, to say that the Pope is in charge of everyone and everything. Well, this was determined by an Italian fellow at the time of the Renaissance, I've forgotten his name, who was able, he was an early philologist, and Dr. Abramson likes the word prolegomena. I like the word philology. Someone who was an expert in texts, that is to say, who brings together the disciplines of history and language and brings an understanding to what a text is about. Anyway, this Italian fellow at the time of the Renaissance was able to examine the Donation of Constantine and say, no. This was a document that, it was not a 4th century document. It is an 8th century document at its earliest, and was obviously just cocked up by someone who wanted to bandy it about to shore up the temporal authority of the Pope. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is the idea that history can be scientifically understood, and that if it cannot be scientifically understood, then it should not be understood at all. And this brings me right back to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, because you have, when you get into the 19th century, with the crush of science and scientific endeavor, just smashing religious understandings left and right, and you have the science of evolution from Mr. Darwin, and you have people digging up dinosaurs that are millions of years old and making everybody think that maybe the world was not created in 4000 BC. And this led to a whole lot of writing about just how unhistorical is the biblical record. That is to say, look, a lot of these people that you think, lived and died all those years ago, no. It's just made up, like the Donation of Constantine. And one in particular, story that was debunked was the story of Hezekiah. And the story of King Hezekiah is an amazing one. I'm not going to repeat it here, but the very short version is that he went up against the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib, who was said in the Bible to be the son of this Sargon II, who kind of finished off the 10 tribes. Actually, really only 9 tribes, because there were 2 half-tribes, so I don't want to get into that. But the short version of the story is that Sennacherib came to attack the southern kingdom and just finish off the Jews completely. His dad having wiped out the tribes in the north, and here comes Sennacherib with 185,000 troops, and Hezekiah has to try to deal with this, and ultimately spreads before the Lord all of the taunts and horrible things that Sennacherib was saying, and basically says, look, here's your opportunity to vindicate yourself, and that's exactly what happened according to the Bible. And it's just an amazing story. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the simple thing is that this story was thought so much of by the biblical writers. It appears 3 times. It's in the book of Kings, it's in the book of Chronicles, it's in the book of Isaiah, and I don't know why Cecil B. DeMille didn't do a kind of a follow-up sequel with that story. But then in the early 19th century, as I say, this was a time, I call it a great debunking, when historians were saying, look, we're developing a good sense of what really happened. We're developing a good sense of what is the historical record, and started saying, no, there was no King Hezekiah, there was no Sennacherib. This is, just totally made up. Neener. And a lot of people were really feeling ill at ease over this new science that was sort of saying that all of this that had been accepted as historical fact was just not true, and the implication is that not only was it not true, just don't even bother with it. Anyway, there was an Englishman, Austin Henry Layard, an English nobleman, in fact, who decided he was going to check into the historical record, and got himself some people to help him, and he set out for the Middle East. And he got to the Euphrates River, and he asked around and was able to identify what had been the ancient city of Nineveh. Apparently you go to Mosul and drive an hour north. And he gets there, and he starts digging up stuff. And he finds a library of a Neo-Assyrian king by the name of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was one of the last of the Assyrian kings. And not only does he dig up this library, but he finds, and of course it's, a library in those days was not, books. These were cuneiform tablets, records then being made by making little pointed indentations in clay and baking them. Anyway, he finds this thing. It's called Sennacherib's Prism, and by golly, isn't it an account of the same story from the Assyrian perspective? This was, yes, there was Sennacherib, and he was attacking Hezekiah, and he said he had shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Now, he left out the part that Hezekiah's prayer was answered, and there was divine intervention, and that all the Assyrian troops were killed. Left that out. This is back in those days when you're writing your history on cuneiform tablets, you would leave out the part where you lost a war. But he tells the same story that was in the Bible about first attacking and conquering the city of Lachish on the way to Jerusalem, and then getting to Jerusalem. And I mean, this was the late 1840s. He found this. It took a long time before anybody could translate this thing, but when they did, and it became famously something that was, sort of fighting back against this wave of scientific rebuttal of Scripture. I mean, there were people lined up outside the British Museum to just get in and look at this thing and marvel at it. Now, there are, in my view, ways to battle back against this type of falsity in history, is what I call the poetic organization of data points. And I use the word poetic simply to connote the idea of expressing in a small number of words what would otherwise require a much larger number of words, and that this sort of poetic organization of data points can flow from a number of different interpretive perspectives. I'm going to name 4 of them, and I'm going to elaborate on one of them. The first one is the idea of narrative shape. What is a narrative shape? One of the best discussions of this comes from the Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye, who was a lion of literature at Victoria College of the University of Toronto. Both Dr. Abramson and I are graduates of the University of Toronto, so it has some special meaning, I think, in that sense. And what Professor Frye identified in his reading of Scripture, and of course he came to Scripture from an exclusively literary standpoint, and his contribution is in the area of the Bible as literature, as poetry. But he identified what he called in Scripture the U-shaped narrative, literally the letter U. The idea that in biblical narratives one starts from a point of stasis, descends into some kind of negativity or a lesser stasis, from which one is rescued or saved or brought to salvation or brought back to a better stasis at the upside of the other side of the letter U. And he maintained that this U-shaped narrative belonged, or rather typified or described, every narrative in all of Scripture, with one exception, that being the parable of the prodigal son. The parable of the prodigal son, of course, is a story of a person who takes his inheritance, leaves his family, goes out, spends the whole inheritance, is left, feeding pigs, and decides that, my father's servants live better than this. I'll return to my father and I'll be a servant. But you see, this doesn't fit the narrative. This is someone who, on his own, comes to a conclusion that he can climb up out of his reduced stasis by himself. He comes up with it on his own. I would call this the Pelagian parable, because it is a function of initiative that the prodigal son comes home. Now, that's the U-shaped narrative. Another mode of understanding history might flow from the idea of gyres, and it's a weird word. Dr. Abramson alluded to it just once, tantalizingly just once, but it's a very useful mental construct in understanding how one age leads to another. And the idea of the gyres was popularized by the poet William Butler Yeats. The widening gyre, if you're familiar with his poetry. But what it is, as you can see here, the idea of interlocking cones. That is to say, one cone turned upside down into another, representing the progress of history, where the gyre widens following a revelatory moment, a phenomenon, an important person, an important idea, a war, whatever decisive moment in history you might have in mind. And then there takes place a kind of a dialectic, a multiplication of perspectives around that single phenomenon, which over time dissipates, moves further away from that revelatory moment into the base of the cone. But then in the middle of that circle is yet another decisive moment, person, place, battle, thing, which then initiates another cone of historical progress. So that's it's a useful idea. The next poetic organization of data points that I will mention is what I will call the typifying moment. That is to say, the identification of a small detail that explains a vast number of related details. And I refer here to the idea advanced by Ezra Pound. I've forgotten exactly what he called it. I think he called it the luminosity of fact. And as an example, and I apologize for referring to so notorious an anti-Semite as the 20th century poet Ezra Pound, but I do mention him to disagree with him. What he said was that as a luminous fact, as an explanatory fact, when the Italian city-states, Venice and Milan, decided that they would not go to war for economic reasons, at that moment the Renaissance began. Well, okay. I'm sure there's arguments for that. To my mind, the Renaissance is explained by a very different luminous fact, and that would be the introduction into Europe of the eating utensil known as the fork. In the Middle Ages, people ate differently. They ate communally. They ate out of a large, what would look to us like an enormous trough of food. People would carry around with them a spoon and a bowl, and one would help oneself from this communal trough of food. The Renaissance was a time when, notionally and actually, one began to use devices to identify ownership. A fork is something that is used to say that, by spearing that piece of food, that is mine. And we have so many things came out of the Renaissance which to this day support our relationships of ownership. That is to say, for instance, the introduction of intellectual property in the form of patent and copyright. the idea that one could own an idea. The idea of ownership is something that overwhelmingly was, to my mind, a feature of the Renaissance. Well, I could go on, but who cares? The important thing is that this is, as I say, a different way of organizing data points. Now, the fourth and final method of organizing data points that I will discuss, and I'm going to elaborate on it later, is the idea of historical ironies. Now, what is irony? Irony is something which is infamously difficult to define, but it actually isn't. An irony, at its most basic, is very simply a contrast. Now, there's all different types, and that's the problem with irony. It's not so much difficult to define. It's that you cannot contain the number of different forms that it can take, but it's a very, very basic way of understanding or observing the world. Now, if you have a young child, a very young child, and you put a toy in front of the child, and you say to the child, "You see your toy?" And the kid says, "Yeah." And then you remove the toy from in front of the child, and you say, "Is your toy there now?" The child will giggle. Go, "No." Why? There's a contrast. I think there's an expression called object continuity, is something that develops early in childhood. The idea that something exists, can disappear, but that doesn't mean it ceased to exist. It may come back. But one has an expectation that will continue to be there, so that when the toy is removed, that expectation is interrupted. So there is a contrast between what you expect and what occurs, and that's irony. Now, there's lots of different kinds of irony. There's situational irony and dramatic irony. There's a long, long, long list of different types of ironies, and it gets associated, unfortunately, with the idea of sort of cleverness, which doesn't really serve the concept. I mean, if you look at irony as really just something that you might not expect. The fire station burned to the ground. Well, fire stations, they're all about putting out fires and preventing fires and not having fires and putting an end to fires, and then what, they couldn't even put out a fire at the fire station? Well, that's ironic, isn't it? It's contrary to expectation. Now, I'm going to develop that in the context of what I understand to be different types of ironies that apply to different threads of history. Now, before I get into the types of ironies, I want to just mention one incident involving three people, which, to my mind, is a luminous fact, is something that could be described as the apex of a cone in a gyre, and perhaps most importantly assists in the understanding of the handing off of the baton, if you will, from ancient histories which were written to advance a cause, advance a notion, support a monarch, and that sort of thing, to the idea of modern history being the pursuit of objectivity, the Archimedean point of understanding. And to describe this event, and it was a very, very short event, presumably happened in the course of an afternoon, I need to describe the three people who were there. One of them was a Roman by the name of Vespasian, and Vespasian was a Roman person of low birth. He was from Italy. He was true blood, hardcore Roman in terms of Roman virtue. And the word virtue is a very Roman word. And he rose up through the ranks, through the equestrian order within the Roman military, and ultimately became a general. He was called upon to assist the Emperor Claudius in his invasion and conquest of Britain. Vespasian subdued and conquered for Rome the part of England that my ancestors are from, southwest England. He came at it in a very Roman way, which was to say, look, we're here, we are Roman, we've got all these troops, and really we would have no difficulty in just slaying you all completely, but guess what? We represent a civilization that, once you get into it, you're going to like it. Now, we're here because we want to mine your tin and your lead and your silver and all that kind of thing. But you know what? You can work in the mines. Some of you will be slaves, but not all. And you know what? You're going to get to like it. Well, whether or not that happened, I don't know. But that was Vespasian's approach. It was a Roman approach. But as I say, this guy was of low birth, no breeding, no aristocratic background. When after Claudius, the Emperor Nero came to power, and Nero, of course, was a bit of a nutbar. Nero decided to drag a bunch of his generals, including Vespasian, on a tour of Greece, because Nero fancied himself as the sort of poet king, and he was going to sing and dance and do all these things because he thought everybody should look at him and applaud him and this kind of thing. And Vespasian, who was a mule breeder by profession, made the horrible mistake of falling asleep during one of Nero's performances, and had to get out of town fast, and did, and hid out for a while. But in 66 A.D., there was a revolt in Judea, where the Jews there came up with the idea that they could fight the Roman Empire and beat it. Well, that didn't work out so well, as you probably know, but somebody had to go deal with this, because these rebellious Jews seemed to be able to win where no one would expect them to win, and there were they overcame an entire Roman legion. I mean, miraculously, nobody could. And of course, I mean, that just fired them all up, and they decided, well, look, we can beat these guys, and look, we stood up to the Seleucid Greeks, we can stand up to these guys. Well, Nero calls Vespasian out of hiding and says, look, you've drawn the short straw on this, pal. You got to go and subdue these guys, because they are a big problem. Vespasian says, okay, he's up to the task, and he heads down into the area of Galilee and starts beating up on everybody there, and essentially getting the word out that he's there on behalf of Rome, and no, you don't mess with Rome. And he made his position very clear. Now, next participant is this fellow named Josephus. Now, Josephus was sort of in charge of the northern garrison. He saw or heard of and knew about the approach of Vespasian. He didn't really know what to do. He was a Jew who, wanted obviously the best for himself and the best for his people, but he really didn't know, and he was an extremely ambivalent individual in a lot of ways. As Vespasian approached, he concluded that this was not going to work out well. He entered into a suicide pact with his fellow Jews with the idea that they were going to kill each other, and then the last person standing would kill himself. However, when it was down to Vespasian and one other guy, Vespasian said, no, you know what, I'm going to surrender. And he did. And he surrendered. Josephus surrendered to Vespasian. Vespasian really didn't know what to make of this guy. Josephus was obviously erudite. He offered to help Vespasian. Vespasian figured, look, I'm heading down towards Jerusalem to quell this rebellion. This guy, Josephus, he speaks a lot of languages. He knows the culture. He knows what's going on. He said, okay, Josephus, you can be my slave. So he enslaves Josephus. So Vespasian and Josephus and a whole bunch of Roman soldiers head south towards Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was in a bit of a mess, and this whole narrative, I cannot improve on the presentation of the narrative given by Dr. Abramson. And I'm just going to pick out of that narrative, though, the character known as Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. And he was typical of the Pharisaic Jews in Jerusalem, looking to achieve and maintain peace going forward. He would have been opposed to the Sadducees. The Sadducees were very much co-opted culturally and politically to the Roman rule. The Pharisees, by contrast, looked to maintain a type of traditional Judaic authority, but were also practically minded, and both those groups were at odds with a group called the Zealots. And it's the Zealots who had the idea that they could fight Rome and win. And in Jerusalem at that time, you have not only a rebellion against Rome, but you also have huge fights. I mean, like, not just debates, but like real live fighting between Jews over the issue of whether or not to fight Rome. One group, even just to try to make their fellow Jews fight Rome, set fire to the food supply so that people couldn't just hole up and wait. They wanted them to get out there and just fight these guys and win. Which, you know what? Wasn't going to happen. On the other hand, as I say, these are people who lived with the historical record of King Hezekiah, who managed to slaughter over 180,000 Assyrian troops by praying. So that's sort of the dynamic that's going on here. Yohanan ben Zakkai decides that he's going to go out and meet Vespasian in these circumstances. And this is the Roman general, later emperor, who had shown up to subjugate Jerusalem. Now, Vespasian knew a bit about Yohanan ben Zakkai because Yohanan ben Zakkai, to his knowledge, was attempting, unsuccessfully, but attempting to get people to surrender, just to say, look, we're sorry, but look, you're Rome and we're not, and let's be friends. And to get out of, famously, to get out of the city of Jerusalem, Yohanan ben Zakkai climbs into a coffin, and he had two of his students, Rabbi Eleazar and Rabbi Joshua, carry the coffin outside the city. So this is the only way he could escape, because there were rules about dead bodies in the city and so on. And anyway, this is how he makes his escape. And I'm going to talk about Eleazar and Joshua later. Keep them in mind. They come up in another context. But anyway, this coffin gets carried outside of Jerusalem, and out pops Yohanan ben Zakkai, who then meets with Vespasian and Vespasian's slave, Josephus. And Vespasian, who knew about Yohanan ben Zakkai, says, "Are you Yohanan ben Zakkai?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Whatever you want, I'll give you." And Yohanan ben Zakkai says, famously, "Give me Yavna and its sages." Why did he say that? He said that because he understood at that point that the temple at Jerusalem was about to be destroyed, and he wanted to ensure the continuity of Jewish learning. So he said to Vespasian, Yavna, by the way, it's a small town in, I guess, central Israel, and then there was a yeshiva of some sort there, and this became the point of continuity for rabbinic Judaism. Now, the important thing here is that you've got these three people in one tent for an afternoon outside of Jerusalem. But just consider the transfer, the handing off of the baton from the old school of historical interpretation, which would be represented by Yohanan ben Zakkai, the kind of reductionism that was part of history before the idea of what really happened. And this idea had been around for a while, because there's Herodotus, the father of history, going back at this point some 4 or 5 centuries. But you look at what Yohanan ben Zakkai, he was the first of the Tanaim. He was the first rabbi mentioned in the Mishnah. That is to say, the written reduction of the oral law. And the Josephus, of course, he wrote The Jewish War, which is a detailed historical account of what happened, provides real live chronologies describing real live people, and is based, to some greater or lesser extent, on real live data points. This is to be contrasted with the type of history represented by Yohanan ben Zakkai. The Talmud describes the destruction of Jerusalem not as Josephus did, as an historian with all these data points. The Talmud told a story, the story of Bar Kamsa. And I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but very simply the story is that there was a Jew in Jerusalem who wanted to have a big celebration. He sent his servant to invite his friend Kamsa. His servant mistakenly invites a different guy, Bar Kamsa, who was an enemy, not a friend. Bar Kamsa shows up. There's a big fuss, and the host doesn't want his enemy to be there. Bar Kamsa goes off and says to the Romans, "Look, this guy here is against Rome, and doesn't want to pay taxes, and whatever." He makes up some story about the host, and then. Oh no, it wasn't that at all. It was he said that the host opposed the making of sacrifices by the Romans, and this incensed the Romans, and the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. And the moral of the story is that Jerusalem collapsed because of senseless disputes between Jews. But you see, this is a different way to tell history. It's the use of the parable, the paradigmatic story, to communicate what it is you really need to know, and it can be done in a much shorter space, particularly since you're not burdened with the recitation of facts. Now, with that, I would like to conclude this video and invite you to watch my next video, which will address these different types of ironies that I've mentioned. In the meantime, thank you for watching.